Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. In today's episode, we'll be discussing BRICS, an informal intergovernmental organization comprised of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with perspectives from each respective BRICS member and what the emergence of the alliance means for the international rules-based order. Dedicated to fostering a rational and evidence-based approach to Canadian security and defense, the CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. For today's episode on BRICS, we'll be speaking to, in order from B to S, Matias Spektor, Max Bergman, Shyam Saran, Zoe Liu, and Philani Matembu. We'll begin today's episode with Matias Spektor, Professor of International Relations at Fundacao Getulio Vargas in Sao Paulo. Matias, thanks for joining the Expert Series today. So how does Brazil view its role within the BRICS alliance?
Most people in the West have a really hard time trying to make sense why a country like Brazil would value the BRICS so much. So let me try and give you a sense of what drives elite perception in Brazil about the BRICS. Brazilian foreign policy elites see the BRICS as the most ambitious attempt at paving the way for multipolarity. They see the BRICS as the one instance in the last decade of a grouping that seeks to show the world that the West is not the only way to organize and think about and promote global order, that there are other values and principles that could be guiding lights for how one thinks about and engenders some kind of order internationally. Of course, we can question whether that is at all what the BRICS have produced, but the fact is that from a Brazilian perspective, the BRICS is super important. Also, it's worth mentioning, whenever Brazilian presidents meet their BRICS peers, that's the one international forum in which Brazil rubs shoulders with really powerful countries, because Brazil, of course, is not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It has limited pull in the World Bank and in the IMF. It's a relevant player in the WTO, but the WTO has been, to all practical effect, in decline for many, many years. So all these factors reinforce the importance of the BRICS. And finally, Brazil's largest trade relationship today is with China. And BRICS meetings allow whoever is president of Brazil to have a dedicated time with the president of China. And for a country like Brazil that's growing increasingly dependent on China, that is also a unique opportunity that is not to be missed.
How does Brazil view the prospect of an increasingly multipolar world, especially considering competition between China, the United States, and other Western powers?
So what's important to keep in mind is that for many countries of the global South, Brazil included, unipolarity was not a good deal. These countries remember the 1990s and early 2000s as a time of trouble because fast-paced globalization, even when they benefited from it, produced enormous domestic dislocation and change, partly because this was the height of Western supremacy and the introduction by the West of rules that for these countries were revisionists. They were not status quo. They were all about change. Ideas such as, for example, that it would be legitimate to suspend the sovereign rights of a nation on the principle of the responsibility to protect. And these countries feel that these suspensions overextended and that the West, on many occasions, violated both the letter and the spirit in which the responsibility to protect principle was invoked, Libya being the case in point. These countries resent the fact that for all the talk on the rules-based order, a lot of what happens in that period occurs outside rules, such as, for example, the invasion of Iraq and the complete humanitarian disaster that ensued, that misguided intervention. And of course, you can add Afghanistan, so on and so forth. So from the perspective of these countries, they resemble what scholars call the realist school of international relations, which basically says that unchecked power is incredibly dangerous. These countries don't want to see an era of unipolarity. They don't like to see a single great power in the international system because they fear that there will be nothing to stop that great power from bullying third parties into submission. So for them, unipolarity does not coincide with a long era of peace. Of course, we had peace between the great powers because there was only one in the system. But for them, it was an era of an awful lot of violence and revisionism and growth in inequality, not only between countries, but within countries, and oftentimes within these countries. So I think that's the very long answer as to what the attitude is. One could ask these countries, but come on, we know from scholarship that multipolar systems are so unstable and they are so dangerous. And I think that many leaders, at least in Brazil, have kind of forgotten the dangers of a multipolar system. We haven't had multipolarity since the 1930s, and that's a long time. These elites were born and grew up in a time when we either had a bipolar system during the Cold War or a unipolar system under American hegemony. And I think there is a lot of forgetting about the instability that is so inherent to multipolarity. But the point is that when they look back, they reckon that multipolarity is better than unipolarity. And of course, part of the argument is self-serving, because if the system is multipolar, then it's easier to justify the argument that these countries need to be heard. They need to be given a position at the main tables that govern global order.
Matias, in your work, you have argued that the West misinterprets and fundamentally misunderstands the reasons why many countries in the global South have adapted the strategy of hedging. Can you touch upon what hedging is exactly and elaborate on this argument, as well as how the West can cooperate more effectively with the global South?
So when the war in the Ukraine broke out, there was a lot of frustration in the West, in Europe and in the United States, that major countries from the global South were not critical enough of Russia's attack. And many leaders in the West were hoping that these large emerging developing states would throw their weight behind the West more clearly, would come out in support of Ukraine, both materially and diplomatically. And the fact of the matter is that most of these countries did not do that. These countries are very uncertain about the future. They are not sure where the international system is going. For them, the notion that the West is going to win is not preordained. Most of them believe that Russia is powerful enough and resilient enough to see through this war. And they believe that if Russia were to be alienated or Russia were to be weakened, one of the things that would happen is a lot of instability around Russia's borders. So they don't want to see Russia as a state collapse, not because they like Russia or the Putin regime, but because they worry about stability. And they reckon that an imploded Russia, a Russia that becomes a failed state, would breed enormous violence in a piece of land that stretches from Europe to Asia. That's the first argument. But then there is a second argument, and this is the one that triggers the Global South in particular. And it's this notion that values and human rights are selectively chosen, right? So the West is chiding the Global South for not denouncing the atrocities and the barbarism of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But these countries say, well, but what's the metric? Because we see the West making no similar movement, an effort, when the situation in Yemen is what it is, where you have absolute atrocities and enormous violence against civilians, supported by the West and implemented through Western-provided weapons, for example. Or what to say about the case of Iraq. That is a major violation. Power is becoming deconcentrated, and the West cannot lay down the law on the rest of the world. And we are bound to see great powers bump up against one another, creating new dynamics in the international system, in a context in which leading countries from the Global South would rather not make firm commitments to either of these sides, but be free to hedge and to decide what their alignment is going to be as they go along.
Matias, thanks again. We'll now turn to Max Bergman, Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at CSIS. Max, thanks for joining us. So to begin, what role would you say Russia sees itself as having in terms of larger efforts, perhaps by BRICS, to challenge the dominance of Western powers? Furthermore, how does it view the prospect of a more multipolar world, particularly in light of its alliance with China?
Well, I think the way Russia sees itself is as a great power, and it oftentimes, I think, recognizes that its capacity to be a great power is sometimes challenged or limited. This has been a constant struggle for Russia throughout its history, where it obviously has the immense geographical size of being a major force, yet then always struggles to sort of either have the economic heft or the military capacity. So I think that's the context that you have, especially with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, this sort of obsession with geopolitics. And so the way BRICS comes into this, I think from a Russian standpoint, is that it's a counter to a US-led or American-led G7 or global order. Yeah, I think part of the invasion of Ukraine was an assumption that I think has been somewhat proven not correct. Would at least be my argument, that the West was weak and the United States was sort of on the decline. And this sense, I think that particularly pre-February 2022, that Russia was a power on the rise, and that what Russia was going to do with the war in Ukraine was not just take Ukraine, but also would demonstrate to the West of the strength of the kind of illiberal, strongman authoritarian system. And that this would be a real shock to the West and then lead to Russia's recognition of being a great power. And so I think you have to view that as sort of, sorry for the noise, but since you have to view that as in the context of BRICS, in the context of kind of the pre-February 2022 world and the post-February 2022 world. So I think pre-February 2022, Russia saw itself as sort of leading the way in really driving a counter to an American-led world order, with sort of wanting to kind of partner with China. And you saw that in the statement that was done at the Beijing Olympics prior to the invasion, but Russia viewing it more as an equitable partnership with China and that they're trying to essentially make the world safe for autocracy, where everyone can sort of do their own thing and we'll have win-win cooperation when we want, but we're not going to sort of push a kind of democratic values-based foreign policy, and that's sort of a product of the past. And obviously, that has not worked out well for Russia. The war has ground them down. I think it's been a total geopolitical disaster for them. It's isolated Russia. It's made them highly dependent on the Chinese economy and very much as second fiddle. This is going to be, no matter what happens in the war, will be economically devastating for Russia. So then, how does that relate to BRICS? So I think maintaining BRICS and maintaining a path for Russia out of its isolation is therefore critical. And so it wants to sort of keep up the image of Russia being sort of very active in the world. But it's going to very much struggle to do so. And when we think now about a multipolar world, I think the major powers are the US and China. And I think also I would put the European Union in this camp, although it's very hard for Europe to somehow, oftentimes to work together to assert itself. And then you have countries like India and Brazil that are very much, potentially, real world powers. And then Russia has that kind of status because of its nuclear forces and because of history, but it's going to really struggle to, I think, assert itself as in that same club, but it wants to keep it alive. And for countries like India that want to maintain sort of positive relations, it doesn't really have an interest in sort of moving it to the side.
To what extent does BRICS pose a significant or legitimate challenge to the West or Western institutions, and specifically, does Russia's role within BRICS pose any particular challenges?
Yeah, I think there's some fundamental challenges to BRICS, and the biggest I would say is China and India, not Russia, right? So both India and China in some ways have very positive cooperative relations with Russia, yet China and India are competing and are almost essentially in a hot war against each other, not so long ago, and just a year or so ago. So I think that is a big challenge for any sort of countering multilateral club, is how do they actually get on the same page? And this is true with other former Russian Soviet partners such as Vietnam that has real problems with China. That said, I do think that the expansion of BRICS recently is something to keep the West on its toes. I think one of the things that the Biden administration, kind of missed the boat on by focusing so much on the G7. So it's really revived the G7 as a sort of global council that then tries to address major issues in the world. Is that you leave out a lot of countries that are really important, such as India and Brazil, that both are democracies, and you probably want to include other countries like Australia as well. But when there was this talk of creating a club of democracies, and the Summit of Democracies, or the Summit for Democracy that Biden ended up convening, the original idea for that wasn't a summit to bring together a bunch of democratic states to talk about how great democracy is, which is sort of how it devolved to, but was to make it not a summit for democracy, but a summit of democracies, with the idea that you would be bringing rich and poor democracies, from all over the world. Ghana, Senegal would sit on the same table with Japan and the US, in Europe. And that, I think, was then to try to create a pathway for the quote unquote global South to really access kind of engagement with the kind of global North and the major industrial powers. And we haven't really seen a framework there. So I think the expansion of BRICS ends up potentially creating a challenge to the quote unquote West, because we're not really creating real ladders for many other, smaller middle countries that may be democracy or maybe want to have better relations with the West to really access our kind of global decision making, so to speak. And here China is with Russia, with BRICS, potentially creating some sort of venue like that.
Thank you very much, Max. Appreciate you joining us. Here to provide perspectives from India is Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India and former Chairman of India's National Security Advisory Board. Mr. Saran, appreciate you being here today. What would you say are the specific geopolitical implications of India's involvement in BRICS?
As far as Indian foreign policy is concerned, with the sort of increased engagement which India has now with the rest of the world, the fact that it is today one of the fastest growing large economies in the world, it has always had a tradition of international activism, even during the days of Prime Minister Nehru, whether it was a non-aligned movement or whether it was the activism of India in the negotiation of some key, multilateral instruments like the Partial Test Ban Treaty, or, for example, even the Human Rights Convention. So for India, I think the challenge has been that now that the spectrum of its interests have, in a sense, very much expanded in recent years. How do you try and promote your interests in different areas? And the situation today for us is that for different kinds of interests that we may have, there are different coalitions of interests that you have to work through. So it cannot be like in the past, a north-south kind of a dialogue. The non-aligned movement was very much in that kind of structure. What we have been really looking for is how our different kinds of interests will be promoted by our membership of and our involvement in different kinds of grouping. So many people see some kind of a contradiction, for example, between India being part of the Quad and also India being part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We don't see that contradiction because they are expected to serve different kinds of interests that India has, both in terms of issues as well as in terms of regions.
I'm wondering if you can touch upon the India-China relationship, in particular, how India views China's rise and vice versa.
For about 40 years, despite the fact that India had an unsolved, border issue, there was a certain consensus between the two sides that that particular, difference between the two countries should not stand in the way of their pursuing, relations, particularly in those areas where they have convergent interests. So there were always situations where we had to sort of resist pressure from China or what was seen as, a threatening posture by China. But by and large, we were able to keep that, within limits. And at the same time, we were able to, in fact, expand our relations in several other areas. So even today, as you might have seen, that the largest trading partner for India for several years has been China. I think it is only this year that the US has perhaps overtaken China, but China is the most important country for India in terms of, imports of some very, very critical items. Like, for example, APIs for pharmaceuticals, very much dependent upon supplies from China. So those supply chain relationships have become very important. But I think what we have to try and answer is why that consensus of the last 40 years or so, in fact, broke down a couple of years ago. It is not that we have not had problems on the border before. But, there has been a fairly elaborate mechanism between the two countries in terms of, say, border personnel meetings, in terms of meetings between their, military officers or their diplomatic officers at different levels. And in some cases, when these have not been resolved at those levels, we have even been able to take it to the central level, even to the level of, the Central Military Commission in Beijing. So that system worked fairly well in the past. But it is only in the last few years that somehow there has been less of an accommodative spirit on the part of China when such incidents have, erupted. There has been less of a accommodative spirit that was there in the past. Mainly because there is a sense in China that, look, we are in a different league today. India is is on the second ranking level, not equal to us. They have started benchmarking themselves with the United States of America, as the peer power. And so there is also, if you look at Chinese approach to issues of power, China looks at power in a very hierarchical fashion. This is something which is drawn from its own history and culture. That sense of hierarchy is very important. And in the Confucian sense, hierarchy is fundamental to maintaining harmony. And so what may have been a principle for domestic politics has also been extended to the international sphere. So insofar as Asia is concerned, even though India is quite obviously one of the very large countries, a major power, but as far as China is concerned, it believes that a ascendancy in Asia, a dominant position is in Asia, is its by right. And that is something which should be, in a sense, acknowledged by others, and others should defer to Chinese power. If a country like India does not conform to that expectation, then obviously the tensions arise. So that is how I look at it. Why has the situation changed in the past few years? And an additional point I would say is that China has started looking at many of its key relationships through the prism of its own relatively more confrontational relationship with the United States. So in that context, any country which is seen as having a better relationship with the United States or closer relationship with the United States becomes as if this is also an adversary of China.
What key factors would you say have contributed to India's increasing global influence, and what are some challenges and opportunities ahead?
India is today a much larger, economy with a much bigger GDP than it has had, say 20 years ago or 30 years ago. As I mentioned earlier, that India is today the fastest growing, large emerging economy. Also, if you look at, what are the kind of challenges which are facing the world today. Take, for example, climate change, or, for example, global public health issues like the recent global pandemic that we had. In the solution of these kind of cross-cutting global issues, even though India in per capita terms may be not such a rich country, but in macro terms, its role becomes very important. I mean, you can't think in terms of resolving or dealing with, say, the issue of climate change unless India is part of that exercise. Or as we saw very recently with respect to the COVID pandemic, because India, despite being a developing country, was a major vaccine producer and was able to contribute to, in a sense, to that global public good. So there is the obvious expansion of India's economic capabilities, the obvious expansion, therefore, also of its military capabilities. And thirdly, the fact that in the solution of several issues of global salience, of global dimension, India's role has become, in a sense, very, very important, even in some sense, even indispensable. I would say on balance, the opportunities perhaps are more than the challenges. But challenge for India is, to my mind, mostly domestic. Because this is a country of great diversity. This is a country which truly is very plural in character. And there are major fault lines. Those fault lines may be a north-south fault line. It may be a linguistic fault line. There's a kind of a disparate development patterns between different regions of India. So these, for any political dispensation to try and reconcile all this is going to be a major problem. And how we handle these domestic challenges will, to a large extent, determine how much effective we are actually internationally. So one of the reasons why today India is seen as an increasingly more important player is also partly because in a world where there seems to be greater political instability or domestic, challenges, India, for whatever reason, has enjoyed a certain degree of political stability over a fairly extended period of time. So that is also something which gives India a kind of an asset in terms of its external engagement.
I appreciate you joining us, Shyam. It's been a pleasure. Now we'll turn to Zoe Liu, Fellow for International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Great to meet you, Zoe. Thanks for being here today. How does China view its role in BRICS, and does BRICS pose a legitimate alternative to Western institutions?
China views the BRICS as a range of cooperation mechanisms in the sense that this is not a formal alliance, but rather it's a loosely organized platform that provides an important mechanism for emerging market economies and developing countries to strengthen unity and cooperation so as to protect their common interest. Now, in this particular context, China does not necessarily view itself as the leader of this cooperation mechanism, but rather it really is one of the five members. Now BRICS has expanded, views itself as one of the members of this cooperation mechanism. Institutional-wise, BRICS really is not as I mentioned earlier, is not an alliance, so it's not a challenge to NATO, and it's not a challenge to the existing the leading Bretton Woods system, because even BRICS development finance mechanisms, such as the New Development Bank, they are established as a complementary to the existing Bretton Woods system rather than a substitute. So from that perspective, BRICS is not necessarily a challenge to the rule-based order. And then ultimately, when BRICS first met, they were met on the sideline of a G20 meeting. So from that perspective, again, it is not necessarily a legitimate challenge or alternative to the rule-based international order. But then that does not necessarily mean that BRICS members do not want to have an alternative, especially on issues with regard to diversifying the global financial and currency system. And in fact, we've seen that BRICS over the years have been pursuing de-dollarization and alternative financial infrastructures.
To what extent does China leverage BRICS to further its economic goals?
BRICS is one of 4 approaches that for China to experiment with global governance. Obviously, the first approach would be, China push for reform within the existing Bretton Woods system, in particular demanding for more voices and representatives within World Bank and IMF. That's one approach, reform from within. And then the other approach that China has been experimenting would be, yes, BRICS, and in particular, in terms of global economic governance, would be the establishment of new institutions, such as the New Development Bank, right? And then the third approach that China has been pushing is to create a China-led multilateral, broader institution, not just with selected members that are fast-growing emerging market economies like BRICS, but broader global community, both global South as well as established members and developed economies. And that approach is China's establishment of the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And then lastly, China obviously has been pushing unilateral approach for global governance, which is represented by China's own state-owned financial institutions as well as policy banks. Now, with all these 4 different approaches, what the China really attempts, what the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party attempts to do is to have China's demand have China's demand better heard, better represented in the existing system. Now, it does not necessarily mean that China intends to fundamentally change or challenge the existing US-led global order. Part of the reason is because China really has benefited a lot from the existing system since the China's ascendance into the WTO. The four approaches that China experiment with global governance ultimately shows Chinese leaders aspiration with regards to improving China's global representation, improving China's global status, so that it achieve a status that matches its economic status as the world's second largest economy. The first BRICS summit in 2009, they concluded with a clear message from its leaders. Basically, leaders said that the group is committed to advancing the reform of international financial institutions to reflect the changes in the global economy. And they also believe that there is a strong need for a stable and predictable, and more importantly, a more diversified international monetary system. So from that perspective, what BRICS has been doing in terms of developing alternative financial system, in the demand for or pushing for the use of local currencies in international trade and investment, really represent the need and their demand for a more diversified international monetary system that is not necessarily centered around the US dollar. And the reason is not just geopolitical, but also economical, because for all the countries that do not necessarily use US dollar or printed US dollar, whenever you conduct international trade and investment, there is currency risk or exchange risk, and then transaction risk, transaction cost, right? So there are real economic reasons why countries wanted to do that. And then finally, in terms of the experience of Western financial crisis, as well as monetary cycles, expose emerging market economies to a lot of vulnerabilities. And that is another layer of economic reasons why they wanted to pursue, or sort of pursue an alternative to shelter themselves from the vulnerabilities the vulnerabilities to the existing system. And then, obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the heightened geopolitical tension between Russia and the West, as well as China and the United States, adds to the layer of the kind of the need to have an insurance or hedging against potential sanctions. So right now, we are in a world where the pushing for de-dollarization is driven by the combined forces of economic need and geopolitical considerations.
Well, that's great. Thanks again, Zoe. To close out today's episode, we have Philani Mthembu with us to discuss South Africa's role in BRICS. Philani is the executive director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Pretoria. Philani, good to have you with me today. Thanks for joining the CDA Institute's Expert Series. What benefits does South Africa derive or hope to derive from the BRICS arrangement?
Well, the interesting thing, I guess, with South Africa's role within BRICS is that South Africa lobbied actually quite strongly to join the grouping. Previously, of course, South Africa was a member of and is still a member of the IPSA group, which is India, Brazil, South Africa, sort of saw themselves as playing a critical role within the global South, within the reform agenda of multilateral institutions, and but also, I think, playing an important role within the broader development landscape and development discourse globally. And so once BRICS was formed, I guess, but without South Africa at the time, South Africa felt that it's quite important that it be part of that group. And so, I mean, it was basically the first country in an expanded BRICS. And so while we're speaking about expansion now, it's important to note that basically, South Africa is the first country within the BRICS, and the first at least expanded BRICS grouping. And so that's quite important to note. And obviously, it saw that as being part of its broader strategic objectives within the Global South. It felt that the grouping would sort of elevate its own voice within a reformed international order. But it was also looking at it as a grouping that would also provided economic opportunities, especially with the presence of China, India, and of course, Brazil. It may not have as much economic relations with Russia, but it still, I think, sought to expand and diversify its economic relationships. And so it saw it as a group that would be favorable to some of its ideas around the reform of the UN system, around the reform of the WTO, but also some of its discussions around global development issues. And hence it lobbied quite strongly to form part of the BRICS. What's important to note is that there wasn't in the beginning unanimity in terms of whether South Africa should join or not. But that consensus grew with time to the point where I think both amongst the political elite, the economic elite, and even the broader public, the idea of South Africa being part of BRICS has probably over time grown in terms of a broader public understanding of the strategic importance of South Africa being a part of the grouping. So it elevates some of South Africa's key foreign policy priorities.
How does South Africa's membership in BRICS influence its foreign policy priorities?
Well, let's take, for instance, the whole idea of BRICS expansion. Many people, the idea of BRICS Plus might attribute it, to a strong push from China, but also from Russia. But what that discourse sort of neglects is the impetus that South Africa actually provided. So if you go back to 2013, the first summit that South Africa hosted, South Africa pushed to have the inclusion of African partners within the grouping, both African regional economic communities, but also strategic countries within the continent. And after that 2013 conference, what you saw is a growing consensus around the BRICS of actually seeing each subsequent summit as an opportunity to invite members of the various regions where those BRICS countries were active in. So when it was Brazil, there was a broader invite within Latin America. Likewise in India, when the summit went there, it included South Asian countries. Russia included the Eurasian Economic Union and some countries from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then China also took that idea. So the roots of expansion can sort of be traced firstly to the inclusion of South Africa, but then subsequent to that, broader expansion can then be also traced to the 2013 summit, which was hosted in South Africa, which really pushed for the invitation of non-BRICS members, particularly African countries. And what that does, it also elevates South Africa's stature within the African continent, given the interest within the grouping itself, within Africa. And of course, we've seen in this last subsequent summit in South Africa, where we had the inclusion of Egypt and the inclusion of Ethiopia, both important African political and economic actors. And so what it's done is that it's played into South Africa's into South Africa's interests within Africa, boosting the country's stature, but also positioning itself as a country that is coordinating in some way the interests of BRICS countries within the continent, and at the same time elevating South Africa's stature within the global South, which certainly plays into elevating South Africa's foreign policy, given that its priorities have tended to be, firstly, consolidating its position within Africa, and then consolidating its position within the broader global South, but then also elevating its positioning within the broader international order to also be in a position to have, very serious engagements with countries in the global North also, which of course is another priority for South Africa, given the massive economic relations between South Africa and its partners within the global North.
How would you characterize South Africa's relationship with other BRICS countries?
Well, I mean, the initial core countries that formed part of IPSA, which saw themselves as large, democracies of the global South that were pushing for a very strong reformist agenda, within the multilateral system. So certainly countries like India and Brazil have basically been the core in terms of pushing for a more reformed global order. Of course, India has a long relationship with South Africa, stretching back to the anti-apartheid movement. But also economic relations have also grown quite considerably, especially after 1994. And so that relationship has tended to be quite close. In fact, a lot of coordination within the multilateral order, a lot of coordination around the trade agenda of India and South Africa, especially when it came to WTO negotiations, even recently around intellectual property rights. South Africa and India basically are following the pandemic, pushed for the reform and accommodation and relaxing of IPR rules that would allow developing countries with productive capacity to be able to also produce vaccines. And so similar with Brazil, they've also as sort of core countries within their various regions, they've also tended to coordinate quite closely, especially around trade, around the reform of multilateral institutions. They've supported each other's ambitions within the UN Security Council, challenging the reform of the multilateral system. And of course, even within the WTO development agenda, the Doha round, Brazil also played a key role, especially around the agriculture negotiations, where South Africa also coordinated its trade policy closely with Brazil. And also there's, I guess, also a close relationship in terms of the governing party here and the Workers' Party also in Brazil, and sort of a close, affectionate relationship with President da Silva. And then, of course, you go to a country like China, where, again, I mean, a very, a country that South Africa also, its relationship stretches into the anti-apartheid movement. But at the same time, also South Africa seeing China as a strategic country within the UN Security Council, which would see much of its reform agenda sort of favorably. So looking at it as a sort of strategic country of the global South within the UN Security Council that would support initiatives such as a closer relationship between the UN Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council, supporting the funding of the AU Peace and Security Council. And then, of course, I mean, China has been a big trade partner. It's now South Africa's biggest trade partner, but increasingly also playing an important role in investing in South Africa, including in increasingly also in manufacturing. So China, of course, quite key there. Russia certainly also long-standing relations with South Africa, of course, stretching back to the Soviet Union and the anti-apartheid movement. So strong political relations on the one side with Russia, even though with an understanding that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia sort of withdrew much of its economic engagement in Africa, even though it maintained its political presence on the continent. And so Russia has also been a country that, especially when it comes to the political reform agenda that South Africa has pushed for, has seen a country that would look favorably at its reform agenda from within the UN Security Council. I think at times South Africa has been misunderstood at times by its key partners in Europe, but also in North America, I mean, who play quite an important role as investment partners, as trade partners in South Africa. I mean, if you look at South Africa's overall foreign direct investment, the vast majority of South Africa's FDI is actually coming from countries within the G7. It's coming from countries within the European Union. It's coming from the United States. And of course, you've also got economic relations with Canada. So you've got quite a strong economic presence of countries in the OECD, of countries within the G7 in South Africa. Now, at times, South Africa's membership of BRICS is looked at as a black and white thing, as though South Africa has to choose between its membership of BRICS and its relations, with some of its very strong economic partners. And I think at an economic level, a better way to look at it is South Africa essentially looking to diversify its economic partnerships globally, especially amongst influential countries within the global South. And that is how, at an economic level, it has looked at its relations within BRICS. It's not had a sort of what you might characterize as an anti-Western, agenda, even though at times, its positions would put it in a sort of, in the crosshairs of the geopolitical fights between, let's say, the US and China. But I think what South Africa has tried to do is optimize its relations with BRICS countries, diversify its relations, while at the same time trying to consolidate its partnerships within the global North. At times, it strikes the right balance. At times, it's not consistently communicated, I think, its foreign policy clearly enough to its various partners. So I think it's quite important to note, that the most important economic partnerships that South Africa has on various sectors still remain its Western partners.
Thanks again for making the time to chat today, Philani. Until next time, that's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.